Coaching in Session.
Your exclusive destination for unparalleled personal and professional growth.
With your host, Michael Reardon.
Whether you choose to live within limits or break free, your mindset journey begins here.
What happens when you mix the idea of probability and possibilities when you refer it to mindset? I often think of what is probable in life, and we can look at what probabilities are and how they are essentially the likelihood of something happening. Something could be impossible, and then something can be extremely likely. Now, if something's extremely likely, we may do it more frequently than not. But the things that are impossible, there are going to be many people who just stay or steer clear from ever doing it. But the thing about possibilities or the thing about probabilities is that they're going to be subjective to what a human can do. Because when we look at just humans in general, no two humans are alike. Of course, we can look at similar traits. Maybe you're tall, maybe a certain skin color, certain hair color, certain eye color. And then we can even start to compare to strengths where someone is able to lift the amount of weight that you lift. Maybe someone is able to run the speed that you run. But there is going to be someone who possibly can push the bar, can test the limits, can break what probabilities are showing. And so they live in a world of possibilities, but it all stems into what a mindset is. And so when we take a look at the most recent blog that we have today, probability versus possibility, we get into the idea of how we limit ourselves and we start to put our mind into what is probable rather than what is possible. We follow what are patterns and what is predictable. And when we do that, we develop limits. And these limits are essentially calculated risks. Say, what is the risk of me having an issue or me having a problem? For example, there's a probability, there's a number that you can get struck by lightning, or there's a probability that you can get eaten by a shark. And yet those numbers are so minute, people might have it in the back of their mind, but they're not necessarily thinking about it every single moment. I think about the probability of getting COVID back in when 2019, 2020, all of that debacle was happening. I even brought this up where people who get it recover from it. And of course, there's a probability of death. But then again, there's a probability of death of you, again, going into the ocean, of you walking into a thunderstorm or a tornado, or you getting in the car and getting in a car accident. That's a probability. And so when we start to look at the probability, you can live in that fear of that few percent. I think it was 3 or 4%. Or you can say, I'm going to go live life. But what happens, I have found with mindset and probabilities, is that if the probability is touted as, oh my goodness, 4%, that is so big, that is so drastic, people start to say, oh my goodness, like 4%, oh my goodness, like I'm not going to make it. Let me stay inside the house. I understand the limits that you're putting on yourself, but those are just the limits that have been given to you from an outside stimulus. It could be the media, it could be someone else. But the reality is we don't have to allow those to permeate into what is possible in our life. Because if I get sick, for example, there's a possibility that I could die from my sickness. Whether it be cancer, be flu, fever, some type of epidemic. But I also know there's a possibility that I can get better. I think of so many wonderful stories of people who understand that there's a probability for something to happen, and then there's a possibility for things to go in a better direction or a better way. I think about this story quite a bit because it's something I think about often. When you're a parent, you have children, and I don't mind being sick, but I don't like to see my kids sick. So if they have a little cold or they're coughing or they're sneezing or if they're throwing up, anything that goes on, it's just like there's something within me that's like, whoa, like something is wrong. I want to make them better, right? Whatever it costs. Sometimes you just have to allow a sickness to go run its course. But then sometimes you get these big illnesses. You get leukemia, you get cancer, and these children are young, sometimes 3, 4, maybe even younger. But around those ages of 3 and 4, they're able to communicate, they're able to talk, and you have definitely built a connection with them. So what is happening is that you're seeing them fight a fight, maybe a fight that you would rather be fighting rather than them fighting it. But it is their fight. They have to figure out, are they going to be a statistic or are they going to push through and recover? Well, I think of the story, as I was saying. There was an NFL player. He had a daughter, and his daughter was around 6 or 7 or around that age. And she had developed a type of leukemia cancer. Basically, he saw how much hardship she was going in, how she was losing her strength, and how she was fighting this fight. And he was there to support her and support the wife. And it was just difficult. One of the things he had said to the daughter was a football analogy or a football reference. And he says, we have to make it into the end zone. And the end zone is basically you get a point, you score. You don't finish the drive unless you score. And so the score is the recovery. So he told her that we have to make it into end zone. He basically maybe even pleaded with her saying, I want you to promise me that we're going to make it into the end zone. Well, she was like, yeah, sure. Because it was the beginning. It was maybe not hard yet. Sometimes, things can get harder as you're progressing. Well, she starts to get down treatments and she's starting to get more fatigued and more tired. And what happens typically is that the body just gets wear down so much that it can't fight the illness anymore. It was a point where she was coloring in bed after her treatment and she had a rough day. She wanted to get some crayons to color and she couldn't reach one of the crayons. And she was like, Daddy, can you please give me the crayon? Like, I can't reach it, like I'm too tired. My body hurts. And he was like, no, baby, you have to get the crayon yourself. And during that time, you would think, as a parent, maybe you should just do the things for your kids when they're hurting the most. But he knew something. He knew mindset. He knew that if he fought her battle there, and it wasn't a big battle just to get a crayon, that she wouldn't make it into the end zone. Basically, he said, you have to get it yourself, baby. And remember what we promised early on. He says, you have to make it into the end zone. And then that idea became her mindset. That illness or recovering from that illness became a possibility rather than just a probability, a statistic of what the doctors say or what they believe is going to happen. Of course, we can allow a doctor to come in and say what is our fate, or we can choose our fate by ourselves. And this is not to say that we should ignore all medical advices or statistics or probabilities. This is just to say that there is a power that is hidden, that the mind has, that the human potential has, that cannot be calculated. And when we're looking at this article, we talk about so many different things when it comes to the idea of probability. And what probabilities do, and they do it quite well, is that they allow you to be comfortable, where you can say, I'm looking at the patterns, I'm looking at the likelihood, I'm looking at the risk for an event to occur, and it's going to make me feel comfortable knowing that the risk is low. If I said there is 100% risk for you to get hit by a meteor today if you leave the house, would you leave the house? Probably not. Okay. That's only if you leave the house. The meteor's not going to hit your house. We don't live like that. We don't live with this idea of probabilities of getting into a car accident, which is like around 1 or 3%, depending on where you live. And we get in the car and we are perfectly content going to where we want to go with a 95% plus probability that we're going to make it to our destination. What if we started to look at probabilities like that with our goals, with our purpose, with our mission, our visions in our life, with what we do every single day? Too many of us are living within the probabilities of our comfort zone. Because if we say, oh, this is too much, this is too far, this is something that we don't want to do, this is a battle that we don't want to fight, we don't want to make it into the end zone, because how much work is involved to get there. There is going to be a lot of opposition in your life. And you get to make a choice. Do you allow that opposition to stop you, to halt you, to basically belittle your dreams? Or do you say, I'm going to take the steps towards something that I want, something that I believe is possible. Now, possibility is going to be stemming into this idea of what is believable to you. I'm sure the Wright brothers, when they were creating the aircraft or the first prototypes, they believed that they could do it. Yet how many naysayers were saying, no, you can't do this. You can't fly. You're wasting your time. Roger Bannister, scientist, would say it's impossible for the human body to run a sub 4-minute mile. And sure enough, if you do it, your heart is going to implode. Well, guess what? He did it. And then several people did it after that. The idea of what a human potential is what the human wants to accomplish. What happens in America, especially, is that these limits are given to us from our parents. They're given to us from the schools because we learn the statistics, we learn about different things, we see the news, and they're giving us all these fear-mongering numbers because it's easy for the brain to be tricked into negativity because the brain is naturally inclined to negativity. It helps keep us alive. And you know what probabilities do? They help keep us safe. Because if we say, there's a probability that I can crash in this airplane, are you going to go in the airplane? Maybe you start to look at statistics. Is it safer to fly in an airplane or if it's safer to drive in a car? Well, if you do the homework, it is safer to fly in an airplane. But then again, how many people are afraid to fly? Not just fly in the sky to their destination, but to fly in life, to fly to their dreams and their goals and their ambitions. People do not allow themselves to take any risks today. They play it safe. They play games they play life where everyone gets a reward, where everyone wins. They're just accepting the circumstances, the crumbs that they're given. And it seems as if we are living backwards. We are living in what we would like, but we're not even doing what is going to help us attain that like. I think of how probabilities, they might help us make a decision. For example, maybe you're buying a home, and is there a probability of a tornado, a probability of a flood or something? I know here in Texas, we had some issues with flooding a couple months ago, and then in New York, and then Florida. And so the probability of this happening was, I think it was 1 in 100 years, or maybe 1 in 1,000. I think it was 1 in 100 though. 1 in 100 years that they have these freak type storms. And we had one back to back in Texas. So it was like a storm that would happen one every 100 years. It happened within 2 or 3 days or something like that. So we were already ravaged in Texas by all of this water, claimed so many lives. And this idea is, well, the probability was low, so we shouldn't worry about it so much. Well, let's start to look at the possibility of who you can become. Because there is a different approach when it comes to the theory of mindset, where sometimes if we look at it as a theoretical basis of what probabilities versus possibilities are, it's going to be based on a reasoning that is an expected outcome of what we would like. And this can be maybe experimental, where we try something and we figure out it doesn't work. Think of Thomas Edison, where he failed so many times, but yet he said, okay, well, this is experimental. And he kept on going because he knew there was a possibility for it to happen, but he had to figure it out. There was no probability of him succeeding. I mean, I guess we can look at it as 50-50, whether he stopped or he didn't stop, but he knew it was possible. So the only thing he had to do was allow himself to do all of these experiments to see what didn't work and what worked. And so basically he says, I didn't fail 1,000 times. I just found ways that didn't work 1,000 times. So it's just the mindset and how we transition it. Now, one of the things I like to do is science is great in everything. I think it's important to listen to, but then at some point you have an unknown factor, an unknown variable, which is the human potential. The human potential is unlimited. Literally, it's unlimited. Because if we look at maybe our ancestors 100,000 years ago, they might have never thought about climbing Mount Everest, or they might have never thought about going to the moon or something along these lines, right? They might have just said, hey, I'm over here eating my berries and killing my hogs and cooking over our campfire and living in my cave. And this is what life is. Of course, we developed and we have more luxuries, and we're living in a very peaceful timeline and very peaceful life. But when we start to bring in the mindset of the subjective of what we might believe is possible, for example, I might believe more than someone who is just getting into mindset. Maybe someone who's more pessimistic is going to have a harder time being optimistic. And it's not so much that they are thinking wrong, it's just that they have been taught to think that way. If they want to change that way of thinking, they could, they can't. So this subjective way of thinking is based on this personal judgment of intuition, of expertise, of what you believe is possible. I just love the quote from Napoleon Hill, if you can believe it, you can achieve it. And then I think of the Henry Ford quote, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you are right. This is the subjective form of probability. This is stepping into the realm of possibilities now. I believe that something is possible because I believe I can do it. Sometimes people, they're so determined that they know the future. Like, I know I'm going to be successful. I know I'm going to win the gold. I know I'm going to have a wonderful marriage. I know I'm going to have some beautiful kids. It's like they already saw their future and they're just waiting for their future to unfold. But they're not just waiting by the sidelines. They are actively engaged in making sure that the future comes to fruition. So if they know that what they can attain is possible, they just need the action in order to make it reality. When we're looking at this article, probability versus possibility, we talk about many different aspects of what the possibility statistic is or what the probability statistics are. When we focus on either or, it is going to transition our mind into thinking in either or one of the ways. Because if you're thinking only in probabilities, it could be good for a business. Maybe you can look at the probability of businesses succeeding, for example. You can say 1 in 5 businesses succeed greatly. You might say 50% of businesses fail within the first 5 years. You might say that there's a possibility that I can be one of the 50% that win, or I can be one of the 10% that do crazy good. I can be one of the Amazons or the Walmarts or the Apples or the Teslas. You can be one of these big companies, right? That's a possibility. But then what happens is that the mind of the probability comes in. How probable is it for me to get that? How much work do I have to do to ensure that I'm going to make my possibilities reality? This is going to require quite a bit of work. Now, if you have a strong mindset, you're going to be able to do this quite easily. The transition is going to be as smooth as maybe, what do I want to say? I don't want to say baby's butt, but as smooth as some icing on the cake, right? It's going to be just there. You can allow it to be like that, or you can maybe put it in the perspective of you're going to have some rocky road ice cream. It's going to be tough to get there. But then again, the journey sometimes can be invigorating, because the moment you fail, something happens. You get to say, this was difficult. This is tough. Did you almost get it? I know there's people who they do these videos of like trick shots or trick cards and stuff like that. And they would do it 100,000 times or whatever, just to get the viral moment where they are flicking a card or they're throwing a ping pong ball and it goes into a small hole, or they go into whatever, the CD player, the DVD player. And you might not think, oh, wow, like that's a probability of that happening, right? They knew it was possible, but how many times did it take? Now, you could be on the better half of if you do something and it happens the first time versus it might be the 1,000th time. But then again, are you going to be persistent enough? Are you going to be resilient enough to do it 1,000 times? Most people, they stop after just a few times. They might try 1, 2, maybe 3 times. And they say, you know what? This is not for me. Maybe they're in a relationship and they're like, no, not working. Something goes wrong, right? It's easier to throw things away that are hard, but it's more impactful to do the things that are going to create some meaning. So if we can look at what is going to create meaning in our life, it might not be one of the best numbers in terms of metrics and probabilities, but it could be possible. And just because it hasn't been done yet in life and in the world, it doesn't make it impossible. It just means that whatever the task is still waiting for someone crazy enough to test the rules of possibilities. because the moment someone does something, the human potential comes in now, and they're going to say something that was impossible is now possible. And sure enough, that probability is going to change. They're going to say now it's 1 in 1 billion, 1 in 100 zillion chance of something happening. Well, regardless of the number of the probability, you get to decide if you want to do something in life. Look down at the end of your life, look down at the end of the road. Would you be happy that you didn't take the chance? Would you be happy that you just played it safe? And looked at the probabilities and you only did the things that had a high probability? Or would you test the limits of what humans can do? And would you challenge yourself every single day so you can break records and you can break molds, and that you can create the mindset that doesn't just live in probability, it lives within possibilities of what you can do?